The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Rosehaven Palace as Prince Alexander stood at his study window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens his great-grandmother had planted 70 years ago. The red roses bloomed magnificently this September, as if nature itself understood the significance of this day. In just 3 hours, he and Princess Elena would attend what the palace had quietly announced as their final official engagement before stepping back from active royal duties. Alexander's fingers traced the worn leather binding of his grandfather's journal, which lay open on his desk. The pages spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the weight of crowns that never truly left one's head, even in private moments. His grandfather had written about the loneliness of public service, how every smile had to be measured. Every word weighed for its impact on millions of people who looked to the royal family for stability and hope. "The roses are particularly beautiful today," Elena's gentle voice broke through his thoughts. She entered the study carrying 2 cups of tea, her movements graceful despite the obvious fatigue that had settled around her eyes in recent months. The pressure of 25 years of royal life had taken its toll, though she had never once complained publicly. Elena placed his tea beside the journal and settled into the chair across from his desk. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant but understated, so different from the elaborate gowns and formal attire that had defined her public appearances for decades. Her choice of clothing spoke volumes about their decision. This farewell would not be marked by pomp and ceremony, but by the quiet dignity that had always characterized their approach to royal service. "I've been thinking about our first engagement," Elena said, cradling her teacup. "Do you remember? That children's hospital in Yorkshire. I was so nervous I could barely speak, and you kept whispering encouraging words when the cameras weren't looking." Alexander smiled at the memory. "You were magnificent even then. The way you knelt down to talk to little Sarah, the girl with the broken leg. She lit up when you asked about her drawings. That's when I knew you truly understood what this life could mean. Not the titles or the palaces, but the connections. The moments when we could actually make someone's day a little brighter." They had met at university. 2 young people trying to navigate their own paths while the weight of expectation pressed down upon them. Elena had been studying art history, dreaming of working in a small museum somewhere quiet. Alexander had harbored secret hopes of becoming a teacher, of finding purpose in shaping young minds rather than cutting ribbons and making speeches. But duty had called, as it always did for people born into their circumstances. The telephone rang, jolting them from their quiet reflection. Alexander's private secretary, Margaret, spoke in her usual crisp tones about the final arrangements. The ceremony would take place in the palace's smallest receiving room, with only 30 guests, close family members, a few longtime staff, and the heads of the charities they had championed over the years. No press, no fanfare, just a simple exchange of words and the symbolic return of certain ceremonial items to the crown. "Your Royal Highnesses, the Queen has asked me to remind you that this decision, while respected, is still difficult for Her Majesty to accept," Margaret continued carefully. "She hopes you understand that the door remains open should you ever wish to return to full duties." After hanging up, Elena reached across the desk and took Alexander's hand. Her wedding ring, worn smooth by decades of wear, caught the morning light. "Do you think we're being selfish?" she asked, voicing the question that had haunted them both during the months of careful deliberation that had led to this moment. Alexander considered her words carefully. They had spent sleepless nights weighing their decision, knowing that stepping back would place additional burden on other family members. The Queen, now in her 90s, had made it clear she respected their choice while making her disappointment equally apparent. The younger royals would need to take on more engagements, more responsibility, more of the endless cycle of public appearances that sustained the monarchy's connection to the people. "I think," Alexander said slowly. "We've given everything we could give. 25 years of every holiday spent at official functions. 25 years of never being able to have a private conversation without wondering if someone was listening. 25 years of our children growing up with bodyguards and protocols instead of normal childhoods. Their children, Prince James and Princess Sophia, were now adults carving their own paths. James had chosen military service, finding in the structured world of the army a sense of purpose that royal duties had never provided him. Sophia worked with disadvantaged youth in London, using her platform to advocate for mental health awareness, but always within the careful boundaries that royal protocol demanded. Elena stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where palace staff were setting up chairs for the small gathering. "I keep thinking about all the people we've met, all the hands we've shaken, all the stories we've heard. There was that woman in Liverpool, do you remember? Her husband had died in that mining accident, and she told us that our visit was the first time she'd smiled in months. How do you measure the value of something like that?" "You measure it by remembering that we've done our part," Alexander replied, joining her at the window. "We've served with honor, with dedication, with love for our country and our people. But we're not machines, Elena. We're human beings who deserve the chance to discover who we might be without the weight of these roles." The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had been building for years, through long nights when they lay awake discussing their dreams deferred, their desires pushed aside for the greater good. The turning point had come during a particularly difficult tour of the Commonwealth, when Elena had collapsed from exhaustion during a reception in Australia. The palace had described it as a minor case of food poisoning, but they both knew the truth. She was burning out, and so was he. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. James entered, looking handsome in his military dress uniform. At 28, he carried himself with the confidence that came from choosing his own path, but his eyes held concern for his parents. "Mother, Father, the cars will be here in 30 minutes, he said formally, then dropped the protocol and embraced them both. "I'm proud of you, you know. It takes courage to step away when everyone expects you to stay forever." Sophia arrived moments later, bringing with her the energy and warmth that had made her such a beloved figure despite her young age. At 25, she possessed Elena's grace and Alexander's thoughtful nature, but with a modern sensibility that allowed her to connect with people in ways that sometimes amazed her parents. "Grandmama asked me to give you this," Sophia said, handing Elena a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple gold locket that had belonged to Alexander's great-grandmother, the Queen Mother. A handwritten note in the Queen's distinctive script read, "For services rendered with grace and dedication, with love and understanding, Elizabeth." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. The gesture spoke volumes about the Queen's true feelings, beyond the formal disappointment she had expressed through official channels. This was family, acknowledging family, and honoring the sacrifice that stepping back represented. As they prepared to leave their private study for the final time in their official capacity, Alexander took one last look around the room that had been his sanctuary for so many years. The walls held photographs from their travels, letters from grateful citizens, and small mementos from particularly meaningful engagements. This room had witnessed their private struggles and quiet triumphs, the moments when they were just Alexander and Elena, not their royal highnesses. The walk down the palace corridors felt different today. Staff members they had worked with for decades lined their path, offering respectful nods and warm smiles. These people understood better than anyone the reality of royal life, the endless scheduling, the careful choreography of public appearances, the way personal desires always came second to duty. As they approached the receiving room where their quiet farewell awaited, Elena squeezed Alexander's hand. "Whatever comes next," she whispered, We'll face it together, just as we always have. The heavy doors opened before them, and they stepped forward into their future, leaving behind the roles that had defined them for a quarter century, but carrying with them the love, respect, and memories that would last forever. The receiving room, normally used for small diplomatic meetings, had been transformed into an intimate gathering space. Soft morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating the faces of 30 carefully chosen guests who represented different chapters of Alexander and Elena's royal journey. The Queen sat in the front row, her expression carefully composed, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap, betraying the emotion she worked so hard to contain. Alexander's younger brother, Prince David, stood near the ceremonial table where the items to be returned lay waiting. The golden seal of office, the ceremonial keys to various royal residences they would no longer oversee, and the distinctive blue sashes that marked their positions in numerous charitable organizations. David would inherit many of these responsibilities, a weight that showed in the serious set of his shoulders despite his encouraging smile. Among the guests sat faces that told the story of their service. Mrs. Catherine Henley, now 83, had been the first person Elena had ever presented with an award, a medal for her 50 years of volunteer work at a homeless shelter. She had traveled from Scotland for this ceremony, her weathered hands holding a tissue that she occasionally dabbed at her eyes. Beside her sat Dr. Michael Torres, whose innovative work with children suffering from rare diseases had been championed by Alexander for over a decade. The ceremony began simply, with no fanfare or formal procession. Alexander and Elena walked to the front of the room hand in hand, a gesture that would have been impossible in most official royal functions, but felt perfectly natural here. The palace chaplain, Father Benedict, offered a brief blessing, speaking about seasons of service and the courage required to recognize when one chapter must close for another to begin. "Your Royal Highnesses," the Queen said, rising from her chair with the careful dignity of her advanced years, "have served this realm with distinction, with sacrifice, and with unwavering dedication. Today marks not an ending but a transformation of service from public duty to personal fulfillment, both equally valuable in their own right." Elena stepped forward first, removing the sapphire brooch that had been her symbol of office for 25 years. As she placed it on the ceremonial table, her voice was steady but thick with emotion. "This brooch has been with me to hospital bedsides and ribbon cuttings, to moments of celebration and times of national mourning. It has been a reminder that I represent something larger than myself. Today, I return it with gratitude for the privilege of wearing it and pride in the work it allowed me to accomplish." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the small gathering. Several guests wiped away tears, moved by the sincerity in Elena's voice. This was not the formal language of official royal speeches, but the heartfelt words of a woman reflecting on a life devoted to service. Alexander followed, his tall frame somehow seeming smaller as he removed his ceremonial insignia. "These symbols represent the trust placed in us by generations of people who believed that service and duty could make a difference in the world. I pray that in laying them down, I do not diminish that trust but rather demonstrate that service takes many forms, and sometimes the most difficult service is knowing when to step aside." Young Princess Sophia rose from her seat and approached her parents. In a moment that had not been planned or discussed with palace officials, she embraced them both, whispering words that only they could hear. The gesture was spontaneous, authentic, and somehow more meaningful than any formal protocol could have been. "If I may," came a voice from the gathered guests. Dr. Torres stood slowly, his slight frame commanding attention through the quiet authority that came from decades of healing work. "Your Royal Highnesses, I speak for all of us here when I say that your service has been measured not in ceremonies or ribbons cut, but in lives touched and spirits lifted. the boy in my ward who smiled for the first time in months after your visit, the families who found hope in your presence during their darkest hours. These are your true monuments." Mrs. Henley nodded vigorously, then surprised everyone by speaking in her strong Scottish accent. "Aye, and I remember when you came to our shelter during that terrible winter storm, Princess Elena. You could have canceled, stayed safe and warm in the palace, but you came anyway, helped us serve hot soup to folks who had nowhere else to go. That's the kind of royalty we need more of, not less." Elena's composure finally cracked, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Alexander moved closer to her, offering silent support as she struggled to find words. "You all have given me far more than I ever gave you," she managed to say. "Every smile, every story, every moment when I could see that our presence mattered. Those experiences shaped me, taught me, made me a better person than I ever could have been on my own." The Queen watched this exchange with growing emotion. This was not the dignified, controlled farewell she had envisioned. It was messy, human, and utterly genuine, qualities that she realized had always defined Alexander and Elena's approach to their roles. They had brought warmth and accessibility to an institution sometimes criticized for being cold and distant. Prince James stepped forward, his military bearing giving way to the vulnerability of a son watching his parents make a difficult transition. "When I was young, I sometimes resented the life we lived, the constant public scrutiny, the way our family dinners were scheduled around state functions, the way you both missed school plays and football matches because duty called. But I understand now that you were teaching us something invaluable about service, about putting others before yourself, about the weight of responsibility." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of people his parents had touched over the years. "Today isn't about giving up that service. It's about changing how you serve. And I think the example you're setting, choosing authenticity and personal well-being, might be the most important lesson of all." The ceremonial portion of the event concluded with surprising swiftness. The returned items were formally received by the Queen's representative, documents were signed with quiet efficiency, and the official aspects of their transition were completed. But nobody moved to leave. Instead, the 30 guests seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a royal farewell that was transforming from duty into genuine human connection. Mrs. Henley approached Elena with a small wrapped package. "I knitted this for you, dear. It's nothing fancy, just a scarf in your favorite blue. I thought you might need something warm for your new life, whatever it brings." The simple gift, created by hands that had given decades of volunteer service, seemed more precious than any state treasure. Other guests began sharing memories, stories, and tokens of appreciation. The formal receiving room filled with laughter, tears, and conversations that would have been impossible in any traditional royal gathering. The Queen herself seemed caught up in the moment, speaking animatedly with Dr. Torres about his latest research, while glancing periodically at her son and daughter-in-law with what could only be described as pride. Alexander found himself in conversation with a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, whose children's literacy program had received royal patronage for 15 years. "Your Highness?" she said, then corrected herself with a smile. "I suppose I should get used to saying Alexander and Elena now. I wanted to thank you for something specific. My daughter has severe dyslexia, and when you visited our center 5 years ago, you spent 40 minutes with her, just talking about books and stories. She went home that day convinced she could become a reader, and last month she finished her first novel." These individual stories, multiplied by decades of service, represented the true impact of their royal work. Each person in the room carried similar memories, moments when formal duty had given way to genuine human connection. As the morning progressed, it became clear that this quiet farewell was becoming something none of them had expected. A celebration not just of service rendered, but of lives intertwined through shared commitment to making the world a little better. The Queen rose to leave, signaling the approaching end of this unprecedented gathering. As she prepared to depart, she took Elena's hands in her own, speaking quietly enough that others had to strain to hear. "You have taught this old institution something important about grace under pressure and dignity in transition. I may not understand your choice completely, but I respect it, and I honor what you have accomplished." As guests began to disperse, embracing Alexander and Elena with the warmth usually reserved for family gatherings rather than royal functions, it became clear that this farewell had indeed become historic, not because of its formal significance, but because of its humanity. The receiving room emptied slowly, as if none of the guests wanted this extraordinary morning to end. Alexander and Elena remained behind, sitting quietly among the scattered chairs and forgotten tissues. Both overwhelmed by the unexpected intensity of emotion that had filled what was meant to be a simple, private ceremony. The returned ceremonial items lay on the table before them, somehow looking smaller and less significant than they had imagined. Elena picked up one of the discarded programs, reading the simple text that described their years of service in formal, measured language. 25 years reduced to 3 paragraphs, she mused, though not with bitterness. But those stories we heard today, that's the real record of what we accomplished. The palace doors had closed behind the last guest only minutes before, but already the building felt different around them. The subtle change in how staff members greeted them, the way conversations paused when they entered rooms, the shift from "Your Royal Highness" to uncertain pauses as people adjusted to new realities. All of it marked their transition from official roles to something undefined but potentially liberating. Prince David returned to the room, having escorted the Queen to her private apartments. His face showed the weight of understanding what lay ahead for him, the additional responsibilities he would shoulder, but also something else. Genuine admiration for his brother's courage. "She's proud of you, you know," David said, settling into a chair beside them. "She might not say it directly, but I saw her in the corridor afterward talking to Father Benedict. She said you had reminded her why the monarchy exists, not for ceremony or tradition, but for connection with people who need hope and support." Alexander looked surprised. Throughout the months of planning this transition, he had feared disappointing his mother, failing in his duty to the institution that had shaped his entire life. "I worried we were being selfish, choosing our own happiness over obligation." "Maybe that's exactly what was needed," David replied thoughtfully. "Maybe showing that even royals can choose authenticity over expectation, can prioritize mental health and personal fulfillment. Maybe that makes us more human, more relatable, more relevant to people struggling with their own difficult choices." Sophia appeared in the doorway, still radiant from the morning's events, but now carrying a large, leather-bound book. "I've been collecting messages from people all over the world," she announced, setting the book on the table. "Ever since the palace announced your decision, letters and emails have been pouring in. Margaret asked me to compile some of them." Elena opened the book randomly and began reading aloud. "Dear Prince Alexander and Princess Elena, I am a teacher in Manchester, and I have struggled for years with burnout and depression. Your decision to step back from duties that were overwhelming you gives me permission to prioritize my own well-being. Thank you for showing that it's okay to say enough when you've given all you can give." Alexander turned to another page and found a letter from a young mother in Canada. "My husband and I have been caregivers for my elderly parents for 8 years. We love them, but we were losing ourselves. Your courage in choosing a different path helps us see that we can find other ways to show love and respect while also taking care of our own family's needs." Page after page revealed similar sentiments, people finding inspiration not in their royal service, but in their decision to step away from that service when it became unsustainable. The letters came from healthcare workers, teachers, social workers, family caregivers, and others who had been giving of themselves until they had nothing left to give. "I never expected this," Elena whispered, tears in her eyes as she read account after account of people finding courage through their example. "I thought people would see us as quitters, as selfish, as abandoning our duty." James joined them, having changed from his military dress uniform into civilian clothes. "Perhaps this is your greatest service yet," he suggested. "In a world where people are expected to work themselves to exhaustion, where seeking help is seen as weakness, where stepping back is viewed as failure, you've shown another way." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Margaret entered with a cup of tea for Elena and a message. "Ma'am, I thought you should know. The palace switchboard has received over 3,000 calls today. Not complaints or criticism, but messages of support and gratitude. The BBC has been calling constantly, wanting to interview you about your decision. They're calling it unprecedented transparency and a new model of royal service." Alexander and Elena exchanged glances. They had expected controversy, criticism, questions about their commitment and dedication. Instead, their quiet farewell was resonating with people in ways they had never imagined possible. Their decision to prioritize personal well-being over institutional expectation was somehow becoming a beacon of hope for others facing similar struggles. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "Dr. Torres called. He wants to invite you to speak at a conference next month about sustainable caregiving and preventing burnout in helping professions, not as royals, but as people who understand the cost of giving too much of yourself." Elena looked at Alexander with growing excitement. This was something they had never considered, that their experience with royal burnout might translate into meaningful work with others facing similar challenges. The idea of using their story to help healthcare workers, teachers, social workers, and family caregivers felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "We would be speaking as ourselves," Alexander said slowly, testing the words. "Not representing the crown or the palace, but sharing our own experience with people who might benefit from hearing it." For the first time all morning, Elena's smile was unrestrained, filled with genuine anticipation rather than nostalgic sadness. "We could help people understand that recognizing your limits isn't failure, it's wisdom. That taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary if you want to continue helping others." As afternoon sunlight filled the receiving room, the family members sat together reading through more letters, each message reinforcing the unexpected impact of this morning's ceremony. What had begun as a private farewell to royal duties was becoming something larger, a public conversation about service, sustainability, and the courage required to change course when necessary. The Queen appeared unexpectedly in the doorway, having returned from her private apartments. The morning's formal composure had been replaced by something warmer, more personal. "I've been thinking about what happened here today," she said, settling carefully into a chair near her family. "This wasn't the farewell I expected or wanted, but perhaps it was the farewell that was needed. You've reminded us all that the monarchy's strength lies not in rigid adherence to duty at all costs, but in our ability to evolve, to remain human, to show that service comes in many forms." She paused, looking at the book of letters Sophia had compiled. "These messages suggest that your decision today may serve more people than 25 more years of traditional royal duties ever could. If sharing your story helps others find balance in their own service to family, community, or profession, then perhaps this transition is not a step away from duty, but a step toward a different kind of service entirely." Alexander felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying finally lift from his shoulders. The Queen's words offered not just acceptance, but validation of the path they had chosen. This morning's ceremony had indeed become historic, not because of its formal significance, but because of its ripple effects, its demonstration that even institutions built on tradition could embrace change, growth, and authentic human experience. As evening approached and the family prepared to part ways, Elena took Alexander's hand and looked around the receiving room one final time. Tomorrow they would wake up as private citizens for the first time in their adult lives. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying, full of possibilities they had never dared to imagine. "Thank you," Elena said to the room, to the building, to the life they were leaving behind. "Thank you for teaching us about service, about sacrifice, about the privilege of being trusted with other people's hopes and dreams. And thank you for releasing us to discover what comes next." Their quiet farewell had become a historic moment of grace and emotion, creating waves of change that would extend far beyond the palace walls, touching lives they would never meet, but whose struggles they now understood in ways they never had before. In stepping down from their roles, they had stepped into their future, carrying with them the love and lessons of their royal service, while opening their hearts to new possibilities for making a difference in the world.